Well, it's the middle of the week, and I'm glad you are with me for today's devotion. We are in Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, so go ahead and open your Bible there. When I read the chapter, what God spoke to me was about the risk and the danger and the power, if you will, of groupthink, of mob rule, and the courage that it takes to not go along with groupthink and mob rule, to not be swayed by it. You'll remember in chapter 22, at the end of it, Jesus had, during the night after his arrest, been on trial before the Jewish Sanhedrin, their Jewish council, which was made up of 71 men, priests, scribes, Pharisees, elders, etc. They were the most powerful body within Judaism. And so that's who Jesus is on trial before. And that morning, the following morning, when the trial ends, in verse 1 of chapter 23, it says, then the whole body, this whole council, 71 men, got up and brought Jesus before Pilate. And then, of course, Pilate interviews Jesus, questions him, and talks to these leaders of Judaism. And verses 8 and following sends Jesus over to King Herod, who also interrogates Jesus. And then Herod sends him back to Pilate, and Pilate talks to Jesus some more. And in verses 13 and following, Pilate brings the chief priest and the rulers and the people, this group that had brought Jesus to him, wanting him to approve Jesus for execution. He invites them back in. And he said to them in verse 14, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I've questioned him privately as well as in front of you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you have made against him. Verse 15, no, nor has Herod. So Pilate says, me, the Roman governor of Judea, and Herod, King Herod, neither of us find anything wrong with Jesus, any reason to execute him. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to punish him and then release him. But this group that wanted Jesus executed, in verse 18, notice what they do. They cried out all together, saying, away with this man, and release for us Barabbas. Now look at verses 20 and following. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. He spoke to them again. But they kept on calling. They kept on. They were insistent, calling out, saying, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And he said to them the third time, why? What evil has this man done? I found no guilt in him, demanding death. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. In verse 23, they were insistent. They were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified. And notice the end of verse 23, and their voices began to prevail. And their voices began to prevail. Verse 24, ultimately what did Pilate do? Pronounced sentence that their demand granted. In other words, he gave in to them and had Jesus executed. It was true then, it's true today. If you shout anything loudly enough and long enough, people will believe it. It's just the way life is. Doesn't have to be true, doesn't have to be good. If you shout it loud enough and long enough, it will carry the day quite often. That is our modern culture. And the tactic today, both on the left and the right, is to take a term, a word, a group, and brand it in a negative way. And if you keep speaking about that negatively enough, you say it enough and you say it loudly enough and you get enough people to shout it and enough people to say it over and over, then it becomes true even if it's not true. That's our culture. That's what happened here with Jesus. He was branded a criminal. Pilate knew he wasn't, but he was branded one. Now, Pilate was a cruel man. We know that from history. Very cruel, vicious. He went along with them because their voices carried the day, and he didn't want a riot on his hand. And it was easier for him just to have one person, Jesus, executed than to deal with a riot. So he went along with the mob, the power, the danger of a mob, of groupthink, of shouting, branding people, branding words over and over and over. It takes being a person of principle, of convictions, to not listen to the noise, to look beyond the branding that opponents do to a person or an idea, to see the truth behind the shouting and the screams and the incessant talking. There's an interesting note in chapter 23, verse 48. All the crowds who came together for this spectacle, that's the crucifixion. We jump ahead, Jesus is nailed to the cross, and he's died. And while he was being crucified, people showed up to see the spectacle, just to, like you look at some things in American history, and years ago, people would show up to watch a public hanging. They all showed up to see the spectacle of Jesus being nailed to the cross. Verse 48, the crowds who came together for this spectacle, when they observed what happened, and when you read the verses before, what they saw was how Jesus died, the manner in which he died. At the end of verse 48, they began to return, beating their breast, a sign of grief. In other words, the crowd that showed up out of curiosity and that hurled abuse at Jesus, once they saw how he died, had a change of heart and had regret. Now, brothers and sisters, when you get caught up in groupthink, this side against that side, and the way we brand people and brand words, instead of being a person of principle and intelligence to look beyond the noise and the shouting, to actually see the truth, I promise you there will be some moments in your future when you have regrets, because you will realize that you were duped, that you fell for a lie, and the process may have even done something wrong. So be careful. There was one man that stood out in all of this. Remember back in verse 1 of chapter 23, it said the whole council took Jesus to Pilate for trial to be executed. Well, that's a way of, sometimes we say, well, the whole world is on its head. Well, we don't mean every person, but, just about everybody, the majority. Because there was one man who was a member of the council that did not go along with the groupthink and the shouting and all of that. Down in verses 50 and following, there was a man named Joseph who was a member of the council. He was part of the Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus to death. The end of verse 50, he was a good man, a righteous man. Verse 51, he had not consented to their plan and action. Joseph of Arimathea. When they said guilty, he said no. When they said we're going to take him to Pilate and have him executed, Joseph did not agree and did not go along with them and did not support their actions. In verse 52, he went to Pilate and said, can I have his body? And he buried Jesus. See, it takes being a man or woman of principle and conviction, having some courage to not go along with the mob, the groupthink, and the branding. Our culture is sick to its core because we're always destroying others. And God's people should be different. I pray you are. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.